Although I'm guessing it's recording because the screen changed and now you're back, but I don't know what that means.
Okay. All right. So, sorry. So, good evening. So, we are on that. Welcome to the Chasing Skeptics podcast. I actually met you and your wife in Dallas a couple years ago. That was a lot of fun. And I hope things are going well in these crazy times. Just wanted to run, some questions by you that I haven't asked, and I'm not sure if I've seen you answered by anyone. I wanted to say you've studied religions a lot, and you're more well versed in it than any religious person I've ever met. How do you think the religions came into being? Like, how do you think they were formed? Like the people who actually, it had to be people, telling other people. Do you think they were deliberately lying? Do you think it was the best they could come up with? Like, how do you think the religions came into being?
Well, it's multifaceted. I mean, one of the first things is that people didn't know what air was, and this is a big problem in the Bible too. I mean, the whole reason that we have this thought that we have a soul is because we breathe. And if you check the Bible, I mean, depending on which translation it is, it says, like in Ecclesiastes 3, 18 to 21, it says that who knows if the breath of the beast descends into the earth, or the breath of the man rises skyward or upward. But in another translation, it's who knows if the spirit. Right. So I mean, so these are interchangeable. Does the spirit of the beast go down, and the breath or the spirit of man go up? In one translation, Jesus said, let's say Jesus breathed his last, and in another translation of the same verse, it's Jesus gave up the ghost. And by give up the ghost literally means breathe your last. That's when the air exhales out of your body, the spirit is gone. In the Talmud, there's a thing about when a child is born, their rituals on abortion, for example, that a fetus is only water for the first 45 days. After that, it becomes a limb of the mother, and specifically the thigh, or a third thigh, if you know what I mean. And then when a baby is born, it becomes infused with the spirit, meaning that it breathes, and achieves a soul in that process. So it's not really a living being until it breathes. And then, of course, the flood was supposed to kill everything that had the breath of life. And then God had to breathe into his golem, his little clay statue. He had to breathe in, the breath of life to animate it, which is an adaptation of earlier myths. Enuma Elish did the same thing, where they made 7 female and 7 male figurines and had to breathe into them, doing the CPR technique and little clay figurines to bring them to life. So people didn't know that air was particulate matter. They didn't know there's oxygen and hydrogen and carbon dioxide. They thought that air was spirit. Mm-hmm. So clouds, that's spirit. And then, of course, when in Genesis 1, only the Spirit of God moved over the face of the water. The wind, it's wind. It's not the Spirit of God, it's wind. And so in the Quran, it talks about, how God pushes the boats along by their sails, but that's wind.
That's wind, right?
Right. So nobody knows what the hell wind is. They don't know what air is. They think that air is spirit. And so that's why I don't know if you've noticed, if you have hard liquor, when you open a bottle of hard liquor, if you look very closely at the top, you can see the distortion in the atmosphere just above that bottle, because you're watching the condensation, the evaporation of the alcohol in the bottle. And that's why hard liquor is referred to as spirits.
Oh, yeah.
So you get much the same. Why does a genie come out of a lamp? Because a lamp has smoke. If it's an oil lamp, there's smoke coming out of it, right? Why is it called a dust devil? Because they thought it was a literal devil.
Yeah.
So you know what they call these dust devils? Jinn. And of course, what's the plural of that? Genie. Mm-hmm. So why does the genie come from the lamp? It's the column of smoke that comes from an oil lamp. It's smoke, right? It's tiny little particles of ash being carried in the air, but they don't understand that. So what do they experience from a dust devil? A dust devil seems to come out of nowhere, and it suddenly like throws your tents and all your stuff around, it wrecks your campsite, and then just disappears in evanescence, Right. Well, that's what more supernatural event could you possibly ask for? If you build a really huge blazing fire, I mean, if it's a really big blazing fire, you'll create a fire tornado, and that is an ifrit. It's you know what an ifrit is?
I do not actually.
Okay, well, there's the genie, which are they're air devils. They're basically air elementals for those who play D&D, and they're made of air. But the ifrit are the genie that are made out of fire. So you have devils that are made out of air, and you have devils that are made out of fire, and they're both jinn or genie. They're just they're different categories of that. The ifrit are the ones that are, or the ifriti are the ones that are made out of fire. So a lot of people, come up, they don't understand what air is. They certainly don't understand what death is, but they all want to imagine that there's something past it. They can't. They just can't handle the fact that when you're dead, you're dead. They've always got to come up with some bullshit excuse for how you're not really dead. And that's a problem.
It's a sadness. Everything. I mean, the characters like Moses and stuff like that. It's very interesting. I think I might have seen you say. Correct me if I'm wrong. You might have said Moses never existed, but do you think there could have been a guy who said so? Like the burning bush and all the things about Moses. Do you think there was a guy who, went to people and said these things happen, and maybe they never saw it, but they believed them? You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, Moses is based on several of such people. All right, like Hammurabi, who came up with the Stela of Law Code, who was given to him by the sun god Shamash. All right, so I mean, there's that element of the story. His childhood thing where he was put in a basket and floated down the river, and almost word for word that was taken from the story of Sargon of Akkad, and then where he parts the Red Sea, there was a less serious, much more ridiculous, but there was an original version of that was attributed to the pharaoh Sneferu, who his maid. Sneferu, because he's a head of state, he gets to do whatever he wants. And when the problems of governance get to him, and he needs to take his little vacation to Martha's Vineyard, whatever, his version of that was to get on this barge or this yacht that he had, and have these people row it for him across the lake. But his rowers were topless young women.
Oh, all right.
So he would sit at the edge of the barge, or at the head of the barge, and he would watch the topless women rowing his boat. Good to be the king.
It is. Hallelujah.
And one of these girls, in the story, this can be found in the Westcar Papyrus, if anybody's wondering about this. So Sneferu, the pharaoh, and this is 1,000 years earlier than the time that is erroneously attributed for Moses, which is most commonly like 1250 BC under Ramses, even though Moses doesn't fit any of that. The time scale don't fit any of that. But if you go back 1,000 years earlier, then you get this other story. So Sneferu is on his boat, and he's watching all these topless maidens rowing his boat, and one of them drops a turquoise bauble, some little bit of jewelry off the side, and she gets really, really upset about that. She's lost this thing. So Sneferu, wanting to appeal to the young lady for whatever reason, calls on his mage, Jajamank, to find the girl's necklace. So Jajamank casts a spell over the lake so that he can lift it up on one corner like a blanket and reach under it to find the turquoise jewel and give it back to the girl. Now, not quite Cecil B. DeMille, but that's the original version of that story. And the idea that there's all these different elements all came before the time of Moses. Hammurabi was like 1750 BCE. Sargon is way back there, and then there's a handful of others. So what you've got with Moses is one that I don't think there's a name for, and archaeologists are still trying to figure out where was the basis of this story. There's a guy who happened across a volcano, and of course believed that volcano was God. It's a shit ton of smoke, fire, and brimstone, literally. All of these things that supposedly happened to Egypt obviously didn't happen to Egypt. The story took place somewhere else, and then the details of that story were replaced with Egypt. If you follow what I'm saying, so this often happens. You get a story where people did these things, and then you come back, 300 years later, and it's exactly the same story, but it's attributed to a completely different guy. Why? Because the first guy wasn't famous. Who wants to hear about some guy that wasn't even famous? This guy's already famous, so let's tell the same story, but with this guy, and it'll sell better.
And they also might have altered it, similar to like the telephone game that you play
Exactly.
as a kid. Yeah, I remember telling.
So, like Solomon, for example, that the Bible's version of Solomon is not the same as the Hebrew tradition, because the Jews have their own legends about Solomon that didn't make it into the Bible, but they did, strangely enough, make it into the Quran. So, did you know that Solomon had a legion of genies working for him? Did you know that Solomon had the Dr. Dolittle ability to talk to animals?
Didn't know that either.
Solomon had the ability to make the wind blow or not, according to his own will.
Okay.
So these are just, he just lump other powers and stories on Jesus, for example. Did you know that there are 16 other gospels that most people are not even aware of that didn't make it into the Bible? They all tell completely different stories about Jesus, mutually contradicting stories about Jesus. They're all supposed to be about the same guy, but they can't all be about the same guy. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely, yeah. See, and that I remember that was part of my deconversion process when someone explained to me, even someone who believed explained to me, well, about 300, maybe 250 to 300 years after he died, they got together and they decided. I'm like, oh, they decided. They decided what was going to be in the book. Is that what they did? Okay.
Oh, yes, exactly. They did the same thing with the Quran, where, centuries after Muhammad's dead, and they have thousands or tens of thousands of hadiths, which are all people, some guy who's decided that this is what Muhammad meant, or this is what God meant, but God forgot to clarify. God misspoke. This is what he meant. Right. So you 10, 20,000 of these hadiths, putting in these clarifications, like the one I read yesterday. I mean, this is the one where what the actual Quran says is that Muhammad went from Mecca to Jerusalem to heaven and back in a single night. That's what the Quran says. That's it. That's all. It doesn't say anything else.
In the Temple Mount, right? Yeah.
But he did it in a single night. Went from Mecca in the 7th century. He went from Mecca to Jerusalem in one night, to say nothing of how he got to heaven. He went to heaven and back. Right? Living person went to heaven and back. So, but how do you get from Mecca to Jerusalem in the 7th century and back in one night? You'd have to go 150 miles an hour both ways.
Yeah.
The Quran doesn't say how he did it, but the hadiths talk about this weird-ass animal called a barak. And the barak is a horse-like animal with wings in its thighs. It has wings, but they're in its thighs. Mm-hmm. And this animal has the ability to stretch its legs to the horizon.
Ah, the horizon.
So it just saves an awful lot of steps, literally, by just stepping on the horizon. So just 20 miles is one step. So it's easy to do.
If only this existed, or if it still existed.
Yeah. So this is how the people are making the stories, and the hadiths don't have quite the authority that the Quran does, but it's second to the Quran. So this is just them making clarifications of what God meant to say when God was playing telephone and told Gabriel to go tell Moses, to tell Muhammad, who is illiterate, what Muhammad should say to the scribes who are then going to write the Quran, right?
Yeah.
Another telephone game. There's not any truth to any of it. It's just all people. It's part of it is what people didn't understand, and then part is just what people made up. And here's the thing where we get into the desire for make-believe. One of the things that I encounter all the time is people saying, well, why would I want to believe that? I'd much rather believe this. Because it's not about what you would rather believe. I don't get.
It's about what is, right?
Yeah, I'd rather believe that I'm a multi-billionaire, but
Do you think people maliciously made it up, or I mean?
No. They made up a lot of stories that were just meant to be stories and were later taken literally. I mean, like there's one in Isaiah where Isaiah is actually talking about. He's actually criticizing Babylonian astrology, and the Babylonians had this thing where they would watch the movement of Venus and how Venus never rose above the moon. And then when the sun would come up, Venus was, effectively disappear,
Mhm.
right? Never overtook the moon, but then it disappears. And so the line in their thought, their take is that they have this rebellious prince. They cast everything over. This is a prince, and his name is Hillel bin Shahar, and his father is Shahar, also known as the Dawn, who's twin brother of Shalim, also known as the Dusk. And
Mm.
Shahar and Shalim are twin sons of El. El is the father god who also happens to be the sun. So what you have is this astrology where the sun rises and Venus disappears and the moon remains and was never overtaken. So the story is in their astrology that Hillel ben Shahar tried to effect a coup against his father, but failed and was defeated. But when Isaiah comes in to complain about that, what he writes is, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the dawn?" Which, by the way, Lucifer, light bringer, also known as Hillel bin Shahar. Lucifer, son of the dawn, same character. So Isaiah, the guy who wrote this, did not believe that Lucifer was a fallen angel in a war with God. He wrote this thing. Other people later misunderstood. That's not what he believed. He was making fun of what the Babylonians believed, or not even believed, what they wrote. He was making fun of their stories. So none of this was meant to be taken seriously, but people will kill you if you don't believe exactly what they want you to believe now,
Yeah.
even though the authors of that shit didn't believe that.
I had a thing I remember, and we spoke about a week ago. I was trying to explain to someone that I thought it was like an Aesop fable, like the tortoise and the hare. It's teaching you not to be lazy. Now, if I told you, no, there was a race, 150 years ago, all the animals and the rabbit and the turtle, you know what I mean? And I remember saying to this person, it wasn't meant to be taken literally, and the Bible the same thing. Maybe it was supposed to teach you, and whether it happened or not. And I
And
gave
it's
you the example of the lady who was a fanatical Christian who used to say that people lived 900 years,
well,
or
that
who
that was
said,
a completely different thing. The people living 900 years is because these stories were written before the Arabs invented. I think it was the Arabs who invented the number zero. Now, before that, they had a completely different counting system, and it was based on not just counting on your fingers, but counting increments of your fingers. And it was a sexagesimal numeric system. It was base 60. So now, if you do a clock face, if you want to know what base 60 looks like, have a clock face and draw what is it called? The Star of David. I forget the other name for that. The
okay,
the,
the,
the Jewish
the
symbol, the two
Jewish.
triangles that make it the six-pointed star. Draw that on a clock face. It's kind of pretty much it. So it's a base 60 numeric system in which you make a little mark to raise it to 600 or another mark to lower it to just 6. So base 60 can be 600 or 60 or 6. But apparently the 666 the historians say that
Well,
comes from something
yeah,
else.
but she thought that people lived 900 years, and I was
Right,
saying
because they
I
didn't
don't
know
know
how
if
to
that
count it.
happened, and yeah, and when I said I don't know if that happened, she yelled at me, and you remember she got mad at me.
So if you look back like before the Bible, because there was an awful lot of history before the Bible, before word one of the Bible, and one of the things in there is the Sumerian king list, and which is like the oldest written document we have, and the earliest kings in the Sumerian king list, their reigns lasted for tens of thousands of years
Right.
because of the way they counted. And it was just because of translators couldn't understand what the fuck they were reading to get the correct count on that. Because it wasn't a base 10 numeric system. It's base 60, and you have to use these increments, and they're hard to read when it's in clay, and you're only seeing it 2,000 years later. So they dig all this stuff up from Ashurbanipal's library, which is dated to like 2250 BCE or something like that. And then all the stuff in that library is, of course, older than that, and we don't know by how much. We can only date like the library, and these are all copies and everything. So that's the best date that we can get. But so if you can sometimes divide by 10 and get a more accurate number, or you can divide by 12 and get an accurate number. But it depends on how old it is. Yeah, and there's no system to it. I've talked to people who said that it's a very difficult process, and it's not that easy as just dividing by 10 or dividing by 12.
Now,
Oh,
what would
that
you
was the other
say?
thing, is that it's
Oh,
also based on a lunar calendar, which jacks everything up. So Years, in some instances, are not years; they're months.
Yeah, and that's the thing. But I've met Christians who will tell me, no, 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 it was people used to live 900 years, like 365-day years and everything. Now, what would you say to people who are dealing with the fear of the hell, like people who are religious, who grew up religious, and they're now becoming skeptical. They're starting to realize, that maybe this isn't true. And I'm sure you've met people. It's a very strong thing. The fear of leaving the religion, the fear that you're going to be punished, you might go to hell, or even you might have some, like what would you say to someone like that?
Well, I never had the problem with hell that other people do, but I understand that other people do have that. I mean, I've known plenty of people who they come out of religion and nightmares about hell could persist for years. I never had that because hell was so ridiculous that I had to discard that belief by the time I was, say, 13. The existence of hell completely contradicted God. You couldn't have both God and hell in the same reality. And look at it. Look at how strong it is. I mean, you don't have any extenuating circumstances for anything. You either go into this box or you go into this box, right? And both of them are the ultimate extreme. It's like everything is wonderful, glorious, beautiful, wonderful, spectacular. It's a perpetual orgasm while you're high. The whole thing for forever and ever and ever and ever. Mansions on streets of gold, all of that. And then the other side is you're skinned alive and boiled and burned and poked and prodded and all like this and made fun of and called you names, all of that forever and ever and ever and ever. And it's what possible thing could allow these two extreme divisions? Most things are in a bell curve where most of us are kind of like in the middle, and maybe we're left or maybe we're right, but we're close to the same place in most instances, right? Unfortunately, a lot of people think in dichotomies. It's either this or that, even when that's never the case. I don't think in dichotomies. There's very few places where dichotomies and absolutes and so forth apply. So I try to avoid all that. And like I said, when I was 13, I just realized that there can't be a hell. Mm-hmm. Hell is pointless and stupid. It's the stick and the carrot. Mm-hmm. If you believe the empty bullshit assertion that I'm trying to sell you and give me 10% of your money so that I remain powerful without having to get a real job and all I have to do for a living is lie to people and take their money away, then I will promise you an impossible reward that I don't ever have to pay because you have to be dead to get it. And I know better than you're not going to get it. But it doesn't matter because you're going to believe that you're going to get it. So you won't even be disappointed when you die and your brain shuts off. But then if you don't believe it, that is not enough to appeal to some people. And it's not. We don't talk about heaven very much at all. They'll spend hours and hours telling you about hell, but they don't spend 10 minutes talking about heaven because they realize heaven is not that great a deal. Given a choice between the stick and the carrot, most people realize, you know what? I don't really like carrots all that much. It just doesn't have the appeal. The more, if you think about heaven a minute too long, you realize you don't want it. But everybody hates the stick. So they will talk about hell and they will try to terrorize everybody about hell. But in fact, if you had to spend eternity, the entirety of eternity, forever and ever and ever doing anything, there's no way under any circumstances that would not be a horrible prison sentence, that there's no way to escape that. As Christopher Hitchens said, it would be just like it's a celestial North Korea, except that you can die and leave North Korea.
Right.
Yeah. Would you just imagine being in heaven, however you want to imagine heaven? Doesn't matter what kind of bullshit excuse you come up with. If it's forever and ever and ever and ever and it never, ever, 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 ever ends, you're going to want it to end.
Will you be disappointed if there happens to be some afterlife? Will you be like, shit, you know what I mean?
If there's some afterlife, there's my concept of afterlife was always better than what was offered by Christian religion. Uh-huh. When I was a kid, when I still believed in these sorts of things, I remember growing up in the 80s and reading Heavy Metal magazine. And, these are all like science fiction fantasy things, and they're all taking place in different worlds or different planets, different, so I'm just, okay, so this is what it could be. It could be Heavy Metal magazine where you are reborn, but not as a cow. or as a fly or something like that. Not even on Earth. It could be different points of history. It could be different planets. Different planets in different dimensions. What the hell? Let's use our imagination here. So I can be reincarnated, live a gazillion times, but it's always in a different form. I get to experience life a different way with a different set of perspectives. Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
That's interesting, yeah.
Yeah, but heaven is not. It's not interesting at all.
Sitting on the cloud with the angels and floating.
I mean, so if you don't believe me, if you don't buy my stupid bullshit story, then I'm gonna get you to face the threat of a fate worse than death. Right? So this will stop people from questioning your bullshit. That's what the whole thing is about. Heaven is believe me and I promise things I'll never pay. And if you don't believe me, I'll threaten you. And I'll threaten you in this life as well as the next life, because we're just going to find some way to kill you or take away your stuff or imprison you or torture you until you pretend that you believe. Because why? I want to believe.
Yeah, right.
And people have told me many, many times they don't care what the facts are. They don't care if it's true. Somebody told me today that why am I trying to disprove things when I like believing these things? It's comforting to me. If it's not truth, what fucking good is it? And then they would say, honestly, people have told me, well, why does it have to be true before I believe it?
Now, what would you say to people who, because it can be hard. Let's say someone's realized and they're leaving their religion, and there can be consequences, in relationships, family, like my parents are still religious and I've tried to talk to them and I realized, I'm probably not going to, but it can be hard for people, even in a marriage or friendships, family, when you're leaving the religion, do you have any advice for people in that regard?
No, I can't advise people in that. It would be completely hypocritical for me to advise people when I can't manage my own family. I mean, seriously, my family, there are people in my family who are prone to believe every kind of conspiracy, and you wouldn't believe how ridiculous some of these conspiracies can be. They believe that Adam and Eve jumped to this planet from another planet, from the planet Xenu. And I know Xenu comes from Scientology, but some people in my family will mix the two. Okay, so they'll just take every ridiculous pseudoscience belief and believe them all at once, so that there's a mirror Earth to this one, and it's on the other side of the sun. It's in the same orbit as we are, but it's on the other side of the sun. That was taken from a softcore porn series in the 1970s, and somebody integrated that into a religious belief. Seriously. I hear all these. Then the reptiles from the Sirius star system who have integrated it into human society and wear human skin so that they're in control of the Illuminati.
It's kind of like Men in Black or something,
Imagine how stupid a species has to be to call itself man, the wise. We don't demonstrate fucking wisdom.
When you really look at these things in the Bible, it puzzles me. I guess some people don't really care. People have told me that religious people don't apply the same that they would, the same critical thinking they would do to anything else. But when we think of the road to Damascus or Abraham, so let's say I was meeting you at Burger King, and I told, even tonight, I'm in my apartment, and let's say I told you that on the way here, I'm thinking about the road to Damascus. On the way here, God or Jesus came out of the sky and spoke to me. What would you say to me? Or Abraham is even my favorite one. If I was your neighbor and I was walking my son out to the backyard and I told you, God told me to stab him. It really, surprises me that people don't put more thought into this. Smart people, I don't know. And I started to really read through the Bible, and even in the New Testament, there's even more crazy stuff. In Matthew, towards the end, there's something where Jesus brought all the dead people up, and they walked back into Jerusalem.
Well, the undead saints begin wandering the streets of downtown Judea, and I often envision them doing the Thriller. But I wanted to answer something else you said, because I think it was important, and I didn't get to it because we got sidetracked. But you mentioned in the formation of these religious beliefs, one of the important elements about that a lot of them have this thing about being made of figurines. Now, not every religion does that, but it's interesting that a few of them do. Even the Chinese religions. There's one where in one of these ancient Chinese religions, that the gods create multiple figurines for men and multiple figurines for women. For whatever reason, they never take one figurine and say let's have this gender's expression be female or this gender expression be. No, that's not the way they look at it. They think they're individual species or something, right? But I mean, it's like some creationists said, well, when you had the first dog evolved, then the dog had to go walk around and look around for another female dog to have evolved at the same time in the same place, and they're not. Male and female are not different species. But anyway, a lot of these ancient religions, even when they have no other connection to Judaism at all, still have this belief in figurines being brought to life. That you make a clay statue and you blow into it and you bring it to life. And where this comes from, I think, is that people could sit down and they can make clay, and they can make clay that looks like things. Right, so now they make these little sculptures, and maybe somebody makes a giraffe. There's a bit of talent there, or a lion, or something easy, a turtle. They make these things out of clay, and then the clay hardens. Look, I made this thing. Wouldn't it be great if you could just make this thing and have it come alive, breathe into it, and so it starts breathing now, and now it's a living thing, right? Well, that'd be great. Yeah. Hey, maybe somebody already did that. Only that, I mean, that's where all the animals came from. Maybe that's what happened. Wait. If that's where all the animals came from, then that's where we came from. And cue the Twilight Zone music, right? So now somebody thinks that, oh, yeah, that's supposed to be how we created. And this is where it makes an important transition. And they say, well, hey, that's got to be what happened. Let's all believe that that's what happened. What do you mean let's all believe that's what happened? You go ahead and tell yourselves that story, but, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. You can't tell me it's not. Well, I'm not going to say it's true. You just make it up. How would I know, right? Kill the infidel. Mm-hmm. Now, everybody, at the point of a bloody knife. And they
indoctrinate children, right? Yeah.
Right, at the point of a bloody knife. We're all going to believe this now, right? Yeah, we believe this now. So kill the infidel on the word of one or two witnesses. And that creates a very strong, Darwinian selective pressure that very soon you're not going to have any vocal skeptics. Skeptics are going to keep their fucking mouth shut. When they know they're going to get killed for calling out the honesty of a stupid assertion. Excuse me, that isn't logically sound because you were assuming.
Have you ever thought that we could be in a simulation? Like Elon Musk says that he's very sure that we are living in a simulation, similar to the movie.
Elon Musk is a madman. Yeah, sorry, but, it's the thing I detest more than anything is people who deny reality. Mm-hmm. We have very, very complex, and we can demonstrate that we're correct about these. We have very complex understanding of how vision works, right? How light is refracted, how the photons are reflected, and how the information is collected. I mean, intricate, super detailed explanations that require that photons exist. And how olfactory, that's relatively easy. It's just tiny little microscopic particles born in the air that we're picking up on receptors. But look at how we describe how hearing works with the vibrations, these tiny little hairs and the stirrups and everything, the inside areas. I mean, this requires that there be a medium for these vibrations to be moving in. We know all this stuff, and yet there are people who want to pretend that atoms don't exist. And that we're really just a brain in a vat, that there is a God somewhere who's this convoluted madman who wants to create a reality so perfect that we have all these we know everything about all this stuff, but none of it is true at all. It's really just magic and a dream. That utterly perverts everything that we strive for. There's no purpose in believing. It renders everything literally meaningless. It can't be. There can't be a more counterproductive measure at all.
Yeah. That's it. I remember you and I had a conversation in Pennsylvania where you were speaking, and I was coming out of my beliefs, and I had actually visited Utah. And I what's funny is I didn't know that you were a Mormon, and I was saying, oh, you wouldn't believe what they what they believe, and you were like, oh yeah, and you were adding to it, and you told me you were a Mormon. But I remember you told me, Dave, think about your religion, and it's good that you recognize that, but think about how you were raised, and I started really looking into the Bible, and yeah, there's a lot of stuff there, and I think what the Catholic Church is doing is they just, because they've acknowledged evolution exists, right, or happened, and they are retreating in some ways, and I think they don't know what to do. And
Yeah, the Pope does seem to be playing this game. I saw it on a T-shirt once, which I thought terribly funny. It's, "I must hurry and catch up with them, for I am their leader." And then, because the Catholicism was laying down the law for a long time, and then they became socially backward, and then socially obsolete. And so if they're going to be guiding anybody, then they better be at the fucking front somewhere. And then they can't figure out where the front is.
Right.
Because they don't have any divine guidance. You'd think they would know if there really was a God behind this. A number of people have said that if God didn't exist, it would be necessary to invent him. And it's because people want to believe this stuff. When I say that I believe something, and I don't say this anymore because I know what kind of confusion it creates. If I say that I believe something, it means that this is what I think is true, or is probably most closest to the truth, but I can't prove it. That's what that means. But when a believer, somebody who identifies as a believer, when they say they believe something, it means they make believe that. They're going to pretend that. And if they have doubts, then they have to pretend harder, to believe harder, because the only way to believe harder and to believe with all your might is to lie to yourself. And I know a minister who was a dear friend of mine since high school who advocates that fake it till you make it thing, who actually genuinely told me to keep telling myself it's Jesus until you believe it. That's his philosophy. Lie to yourself until you believe the lie. That's what that's all about. That's what faith is. Lying to yourself until you believe it.
Yeah, that is. I mean, and I like Matt's definition. The excuse people give when they don't have a real reason to believe anything. Let's see.
Yeah. I must apologize. I don't have as much time tonight as I hoped that I would, so I'm going to have to bail soon.
No, I really appreciate it. I'm going to thank you very much for returning. I'm going to stop recording. But no, it's great to see you again. I'll call you when I'm in Texas. So here I'm going to stop recording and.